I'm very thrilled for this conversation. This has been a long time coming. Adina, I am so glad that you have joined us to bring your expertise. Adina Rosenbaum is a lawyer at just of course as the thing comes up, is a lawyer at Public Citizen, which currently has
I think
13
we're at 16.
16 lawsuits
Oh, yep.
against the Trump administration. Um, Lisa Wohl brought her to us to lead this conversation and really to help us navigate this moment. This is unprecedented, feels like a completely trite and overused word, and yet this is a group of high impact, well educated, brilliant human beings who are overwhelmed and drowning in facts and misinformation. And so I'm going to get out of the way ASAP, and turn it over to Lisa, who's going to help us navigate the moment. We will open it up to Q&A after a couple of minutes. But please continue to put your conversations, your questions in the chat. All right, over to you, Lisa.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Well, welcome everyone, and I'm really excited about this and have had the chance to talk to Adina a few times. And the idea for this came in much as Anne said, which was how could we as the list grapple with some of the issues, well, so many issues coming out of this administration. And I sent an email to the list to see who wanted to help think through some of the ways we could frame different conversations. And Erin Velarde, Daisy Auger Dominguez, Laura Miranda Brown, Susan McPherson, and Garan's Frank Ruda all volunteered for that. And so I worked with them on that and some other ideas. And I ran USIF, which is a group that works on sustainable investment for 17 years. And we did a lot of work with Public Citizen. They're just very well known, not just in the nonprofit space, but really in working on behalf of the public and in the pro-democracy space. And so was really happy when Adina agreed to have this conversation with me. And they've been an important player for a long time and remain a very important player particularly in the litigation and in the congressional advocacy space. But Adina, I wonder if you could just give a little bit of background about yourself before we start with the substance and a little more in depth about what Public Citizen does.
Sure. So thank you for having me here. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Public Citizen is a nonprofit consumer advocacy organization that fights for the public interest, and we do that through different means. So in Congress, in courts, before administrative agencies, and through research and grassroots organizing. We work on issues related to democracy, fighting corporate power, and in general, just making sure that the government works on behalf of the people. And some of the issues that we work on are government transparency and ethics, access to safe and affordable prescription drugs, devices, and healthcare, promoting clean and affordable energy, and sort of in general, strengthening safeguards for consumers and workers. So I'm in the litigation group, which is the litigating arm of Public Citizen, as its name suggests. And we're a public interest law firm that litigates in front of all levels of state and federal judiciaries, including having a strong Supreme Court practice. I've been here for over 20 years, which certainly wasn't what I was expecting when I came here. It was my first full job out of law school, and I assumed I would stay 2 or 3 years, but I get to fight for justice and work with amazing colleagues, so I've never wanted to leave. One of the things we've always done in the litigation group is sued the government when it breaks the law. So for example, when it fails to release information that's legally required to, when it doesn't issue regulations it's required to issue by law, or when it does things that are arbitrary and capricious or otherwise contrary to law, or when it sort of oversteps what it has authority to do. And we sue across all administrations. I personally have done a lot of work in the transparency space, and all administrations have a tendency to want to keep things secret. So our work does continue across all administrations. But our experience in litigating against the government, I think, has given us particular experience as useful during this time when the government is
Adina, you're
things that we
cutting it a
believe
little.
are
cutting out a little bit.
Oh, it's telling me that my internet connection is unstable, which I'm not quite sure what to do with.
Just keep
So
going. It'll
hopefully that will
If you have
stop.
any windows open that might be draining or programs that are
Yeah, I will
draining
try
your
to do that.
power, just close those. And in fact, when you started to break up, it was a reminder to me to do the same. It's one of those things. It's one of those 2025 Zoom skills that we've had to cultivate and remind ourselves about.
I will do that and hopefully it will fix the issues.
While you're doing that, I'm going to ask Lisa a question to give you a second to do that. So Lisa, I'm so interested in what your work, your previous work that you did, like how that frames your thinking in this moment. What is it about you and your previous work that has made you, um, I don't know, like ripe for this moment that we're in?
Thanks, Anne. I basically have spent my entire career being an advocate of one kind or another. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm like that rare commodity in Washington who's not a lawyer. And and so I started out doing domestic social policy, and then I moved to Australia on a scholarship and came back and did international human rights for 10 years, and then took a job running a sustainable investment organization where we did a lot of this is where we did a lot of work with Public Citizen because we did a lot of work around different regulatory agencies, Congress, and a whole big range of environmental, social, and governance issues. And so, it's where I've spent my entire career is kind of where the public and advocates meet the executive and legislative branches. I do not work and have not worked with the judiciary very much. And so that's sort of the background I bring to the conversation.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And you've been a list member now for a couple of years, and we're so grateful to have you here. You're always so thoughtful, and you bring a very broad perspective, like to help lift us out of the tension of the moment. So I appreciate that in you.
Thank you.
All right, back to you and Adina. It looks like maybe she's gotten herself into the
Okay, good.
microphone.
All right, so let's start, Adina. In less than 4 months, Donald Trump has signed more than 125 executive orders, but at least as of last week, only 5 bills have been signed into law. Can you explain the difference between an executive order and a law?
Sure. So an executive order is a formal written directive by the president that orders the government to take specific actions. And it differs from a law in that it's a unilateral action by the president. So it doesn't go through Congress and have to get a majority in 2 chambers or, and then be signed by the president or gain enough votes to override a veto. And through executive orders, the president can order the government to take steps that are within his constitutional authority, particularly telling the government how he wants them to fulfill his role of making sure the laws are faithfully executed. But he can't override or change laws through an executive order or tell agencies to do things that violate the laws. Now, executive orders are normal things. All modern presidents have used them. And sort of on their own, they're not necessarily good or bad. So some really wonderful things in our history have been done through executive order. For example, President Truman desegregated the military through an executive order. And on the flip side, some really horrible things in our history have been done through executive order. So for example, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II was done through an executive order.
So is this number of executive orders, though? So I think we've finished, let's see, February, March, April, 3 months of this administration. Is this normal?
No.
The first 3 months, okay. And if not, what should we be concerned about, both in the number of executive orders and their content, which we'll talk a little bit more in detail about, generally
Yeah,
speaking.
no, it's really not normal. And I just looked up, I hadn't looked this up before, but in advance of this, I looked up just how many sort of in the first few months of the last few administrations. So sort of as of this point in 2021, Biden had signed 42 executive orders, and that was considered a lot at that time. So, around a third of the number as Trump. In his first term, Trump at this point had signed 33, and Obama had signed 19. And this year, last I checked, the number for Trump was 137. So we're talking about just vastly different numbers here. I
Yeah.
think it's sort of 7 times as many as Obama did during the same time period. And I think there's sort of 2 things to be concerned about the executive orders. So the first is just like on a policy wise, a number of them are really troublesome. So, just looking at some of the ones that he did on his first day in office, they included withdrawing the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, withdrawing the United States from the World Health Organization, suspending the entry of refugees into the United States, and declaring it the policy of the government to recognize only 2 sexes, male and female. And that one, amongst other things, made it so that trans people won't be able to have passports listing the sex that aligns with their identity, and requires trans women to be placed in men's prisons and trans men to be placed in women's prisons. So just, what they're doing, a lot of them are really hurting people. But I think more fundamentally, the thing to be concerned about the executive orders, and what's really concerning about the numbers of them and their breadth, is that they show President Trump's willingness and desire to act unilaterally. He's not trying to get Congress on board with his agenda. He's not trying to pass us, through using the checks and balances of the American democratic system. He just does things. And the power that he is claiming in these executive orders is really breathtakingly broad. He's claiming an enormous amount, the right to do an enormous amount by fiat. And things that, seem pretty illegal. So he orders things that discriminate against people based on their speech. He targets people who disagree with him. Some of the ones I find most concerning are the ones that go after law firms that hire people who've litigated against him. And he orders things that he claims are within his authority, but that aren't. So, for example, a district court found that the plaintiffs in a case were likely to cede on their argument that the president lacked authority to order the U.S. Election Assistance Commission to change a federal voter registration form to require eligible voters to show proof of citizenship. So, he was sort of claiming that he could just, change the rules of voting, and that's not something that he has the right to do.
Is that something that Congress has to do?
Yes.
Thank you. So Public Citizen has brought, it's not 13, you say 18 now?
Well, it sort of depends on how you count it.
Okay, we'll just say more than 13. More than 13 lawsuits against the administration, and more than 200 lawsuits have been filed in total. Before we get into the details of some of those lawsuits, which we will do, can you describe the primary concerns you have as it relates to this administration? You just talked about it a little bit, but in terms of the lawsuits you're deciding as a general group to file, what do they have in common?
Yeah, so I think, our concerns about the administration really mirror our concerns about the executive order.
Yeah.
We're both concerned about the harm caused by the policies expressed, the policies that he's passing, which are anti-worker, anti-consumer, anti-environmental protections, anti-immigrant. And we're concerned about the sort of corruption and conflict of interest, and about the overreach, the sort of incredible amount of authority he is claiming that he has, and his attempts to do things that he doesn't actually have the authority to do. So we've filed, sort of 18 cases against the administration. So these include cases about, a lot of them are about his attempt to just totally reshape the government and stop it from doing things that it's legally required to do, and doing things that are really important that the government do. So these cases include cases about shutting down agencies and offices, including USAID, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the civil rights offices in the Department of Homeland Security that do things like monitoring conditions in immigration detention facilities. We also have a series of cases about the removal of important information from agency websites. So we have one about, there is a specific law that requires the Office of Management and Budget to have a database that talks about essentially how appropriated money is spent. And so that's how you can really see, what conditions are being put on the government spending of money. And you can really sort of see who's getting the money and how it's being spent. And this is a specific law that says this information has to be online in a publicly accessible database. And they just took down that database. And so that database was, for example, how people knew, how much money Doge was getting from the government. We also have a case, the NIH and a few other agencies took down health-related information from their websites. And that included information that doctors were using on a regular basis in treating their patients. So for example, information about contraceptives that doctors, that would list things like the contraindications of certain contraceptives, what sort of comorbidities, so that doctors knew exactly what they should be prescribing to their patients given the other health conditions they have, or given what other medications they were on. And doctors would actually refer to this when they were meeting with patients. And NIH took that down off of its website. Oh, sorry, no, that wasn't NIH, that was CDC. And took that down off of its website. So, a bunch about removal of information that was really critical for people. And then we've also brought cases about agencies allowing Doge to access private information and to prevent the IRS from sharing tax data with immigration authorities. So there are a lot about sort of trying to make sure that the way the government operates is within the law, and that the government continues operating the way it's supposed to and doing the jobs that it's legally required to do.
Thank you. So let's get to the topic of deportation, which I think has sort of gotten the attention of pretty much everybody in the United States at this point. It's been justified under the administration through the use of the Alien Enemies Act. Multiple lawsuits have been brought on this, including by Kilmer Albrego Garcia and by groups of other Venezuelan nationals and nonprofit organizations. Can you talk about the status of these cases, which I know is super complicated in many ways, but let's try to get through it, because I think it's one of the biggest, really crises that I think most Americans feel we're facing.
Right. I think what's important about these cases in some ways is that they're not actually about whether any of these people can be deported. They're about getting to the point where even that's considered. And the government is trying to keep, to deport these people without having to consider whether they're actually, there are grounds for doing so, and without providing them sort of the due process that they're entitled to under the law. So the Abrego Garcia case, on March 15th, the United States deported Abrego Garcia to El Salvador, even though he was subject to an order forbidding his deportation to El Salvador. So the deportation was illegal. And in one of the first court hearings on it, the United States actually acknowledged that it was illegal, calling his deportation an administrative error. I believe that the lawyer in that case has since been maybe put on administrative leave. He's had some sort of actions taken against him for him being that forthright with the court. So the district court ordered that the United States facilitate and effectuate his return to the United States. The government appealed to the Supreme Court, which said that the order remains in effect and that it requires the government to facilitate his release from custody and to handle his case as if he had never been sent to El Salvador, but that the district court needed to clarify what it meant by effectuate his relief. And it stated that the government needed to be prepared to share what steps it was taking to get him back. So the case then went back to the district court, which clarified by saying that it was directing that defendants take all available steps to facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia to the United States as soon as possible. And it directed the government to file a report the next day about what had been done to try to get him back and what steps they intended to take. And the government, and this is one of the things that's really, if you're used to reading things from the court, people follow what the court says, and the government actually sort of gets a presumption of regularity that what it's doing is right, partially because the government in particular tends to, sort of do what it's supposed to in court. So the government, though, filed something the next day saying that they were unable to provide the information. And they said that the timeline was impracticable and they shouldn't have to share any potential plans. The court found that they weren't in compliance with its order and required them to file daily declarations. And they filed declarations saying things like, well, we don't have authority to remove an alien from a foreign nation. So what they said is that, and this is sort of just appalling, they said they would be willing to facilitate his entry into the United States if he presented at a port of entry. So if he managed to get himself out of the El Salvadoran jail that they had put him in and get himself to the border, then they'd facilitate the process of letting him in. And then later filings just were sort of like, well, no further updates. So the government then appealed and tried to get the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals to stop the order against them. And the Fourth Circuit refused. And I actually want to read some of the language in that decision because it's really strong. And I think it underscores just sort of some of what we're facing here. And this was written by Judge Wilkinson, who's a Reagan appointee known for having a conservative judicial philosophy. So this is, not in any respects like a flaming liberal writing this. And he wrote, "The government is asserting a right to stash away residents of this country in foreign prisons without the semblance of due process that is the foundation of our constitutional order. Further, it claims in essence that because it has rid itself of custody, that there is nothing that can be done. This should be shocking not only to judges, but to the intuitive sense of liberty that Americans far removed from courthouses still hold dear." And then it says later, "The respect that courts must accord the executive must be reciprocated by the executive's respect for the courts. Too often today, that has not been the case, as calls for impeachment of judges for decisions the executive disfavors and exhortations to disregard court orders sadly illustrate. It is, as we have noted, all too possible to see in this case an incipient crisis, but it may present an opportunity as well. We yet cling to the hope that is not naive to believe our good brethren in the executive branch perceive the rule of law as vital to the American ethos. This case presents their unique chance to vindicate that value and to summon the best that is within us while there is still time." So, I think the two really noteworthy things about this case, one is just the government's position that it can deport someone illegally and doesn't need to get them back is just horrifying. And in this case, it happened to be an immigrant that they did that to, but their reasoning could extend to any citizen as well. So it's something that really, the idea that any of us, they could sort of mistakenly deport and then say, well, they're in prison in a foreign country and we can't get them back. So it's really something that we should all be finding terrifying. And then, the government resistance, shall we say, to the court's orders is also really scary. And our whole system is dependent on the separation of powers. And a crucial aspect of that is that the executive branch needs to follow the orders of the judicial branch. And so as the Fourth Circuit said, it's really all too possible to see this case as an incipient constitutional crisis.
So, Adina, I have a follow-up on that in the sense that the judge who I think, Judge Boasberg, I don't know if that was one of the big cases with several hundred Venezuelans or if that was the Garcia case, but
Yeah, that was the case that was a class of.
Okay, that was the class case.
Mhm.
So he basically said that he was going to bring action against the president if he did not move forward on figuring out a way to get these people back, which one of my questions for you is, what can a court do at this point to compel action by this administration?
So in that case, I think what he was held, so that was a case where he had sort of ordered that people not be deported, and sort of during the hearing or after he had already said this from the bench, the planes took off. And eventually the Supreme Court actually said that he had not really been the right court for them to be in front of, that the cases that the immigrants needed to have due process, they needed to have a chance to show they shouldn't be deported, but that needed to be done through what's called a habeas proceeding, that's sort of where they're being held, as opposed to in DC. But in the meantime, he did find that there was probable cause that they had engaged in contempt by not, by letting those planes go. Although I think right now they've appealed that to the DC Circuit. So I think that's sort of on hold. I think contempt findings are something that could be brought against the government, against the people sort of making that happen.
Okay. But that's probably a lengthy process.
I mean, yeah, court cases do tend to take some time.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Um, One of the most well-known executive orders, I think, was one of the early ones, which was the effort to rescind birthright citizenship.
Mhm.
Can you explain the multiple court rulings on this to date and what happens next?
Sure. So this is one of those situations, and this was another done again by executive order on the Trump's first day in office. And this is another one of those cases where he issued an executive order doing something that's outside of his authority and contrary to the law. So the Constitution says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. This was enacted in response to the Dred Scott case. And it's always been understood to mean that all babies born in the United States, with some small exceptions, such as like the kids of diplomats, are citizens. But on his first day in office, Trump issued an executive order announcing that people born in the US will not be citizens if their parents are here illegally or temporarily. And pretty quickly, in 3 different cases in the federal district courts in Massachusetts, Maryland, and Washington, the district courts enjoined the executive order. So they said that it can't go into effect while the cases are ongoing. The administration then appealed, asking for those preliminary injunctions to be stayed. So asking essentially for the orders, putting the executive order on hold, for those themselves to be put on hold so that the executive orders could go into place. And in all 3 circuits, the Court of Appeals declined to do that. So the injunctions are in place, the executive order cannot be enforced, and citizenship is the way it has always been. The administration then went to the Supreme Court, and what they're asking for, and this is also what they were asking for in the Court of Appeals, is that the injunction be limited to the plaintiffs in the case. So, for example, some of the plaintiffs were states. I think 18 states sued over this. And they're saying, okay, you can keep us from implementing this in those 18 states, but not in the other states. And so this is like the question of whether preliminary injunctions can apply nationally or only apply to the plaintiffs has become a sort of hot issue recently. They've been applied nationally for over 100 years, but the federal government in recent years, and again, this not just in this administration, has been arguing that there shouldn't be universal preliminary injunctions, that these sort of injunctions against things going into effect during sort of the course of a case should be limited just to the plaintiffs. So that's become sort of the issue in this case, is about how widely this preliminary injunction should be applied. Obviously, it would be hugely problematic to allow this to go into effect at all, because it's unconstitutional and would hurt people. And the idea that, you know, just sort of by fiat, we would let Trump sort of change the rules of citizenship that are in the Constitution is really problematic. And just on a practical level, it would be ridiculous for different parts of the country to have different rules of citizenship. So right now, that's before the Supreme Court, and they're going to be hearing oral argument. I believe that's on May 15th or 16th.
Okay, it's May 15th or 16th?
I believe so. I can actually quickly look that up.
Thank you. While you're doing that, you talked a little bit about what's happening with federal agencies, but you've been quite active in responding to efforts to terminate federal agencies, as well as programs within some agencies. There have been mass firings as well. Does this assault on the federal government employees have any kind of even remotely like this precedent? And let's just, I'll stop there.
No. The oral arguments are on May 15th on the birthright citizenship case. Now, we actually got asked that in one of the cases where we got an order sort of putting on hold their attempts to eliminate an agency. On the appeal, one of the judges on the DC circuit asked, like, can you point to any other, you know, decisions like this, injunctions like this? And we were like, well, no, because this just hasn't been done before. I think we were able to come up with sort of one, maybe something done by Nixon. But this, this isn't something, it is very unusual. And the attacks on agencies have real effects. The agencies that are being eliminated do really important work. As do, mostly what we've been focused on is actually eliminating agencies, but there's also, huge reductions in the workforce happening in many agencies. I was thinking about this the other day. I have twin toddlers, and someone gave me a gift, a toy that's a pull toy. And a friend was over, you pull a little cat on a string. And a friend was over and looked at the toy and was like, doesn't that seem like it might be a sort of risk of strangulation? And my immediate response was like, well, like it's labeled as being for kids their age, so I assume it's fine. And I think we often have the assumption when we buy things that they're probably fine, that, when we buy food, someone is making sure that it's not covered in bacteria. And when we buy sort of, toys for our kids, that someone's making sure that they're not going to kill our kids. And when we buy medicine, that someone has made sure that that medication is safe. But there have been some documents that have come out that show that Trump is considering sort of essentially eliminating the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which is the agency that regulates toy safety. And there are thousands of people have been cut from the Food and Drug Administration, which regulates foods and drugs. So, these sort of assumptions we have that someone's sort of looking out for our safety, that I think we just have always had, I'm not sure is going to sort of be a safe assumption going forward in the same way.
Well, and can you talk a little bit for a minute about foreign aid? I spent 10 years doing international development and human rights, and, USAID and the State Department were regular actors, particularly USAID. And, of all the different countries in the world and multiple bilateral agencies, USAID was one of the largest funders of a lot of what went on globally around the world in the hardest reach and hardest hit parts of the world. Is that money essentially gone now? And does the US basically have no more real substantive role in international development?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, like huge amounts of it, is gone. So we have two cases about USAID, one that's sort of over the dismantling of the agency overall, and one over the freezing of foreign service funds. And I don't think I can sort of stress enough the importance of this. So documents from USAID estimate that the withdrawing of aid and canceling of grants could cause up to 18 million additional cases of malaria per year, and as many as 166,000 additional deaths, that they can cause 200,000 additional children paralyzed by polio each year, along with sort of hundreds of millions of polio infections. 1 million children not treated for severe acute malnutrition, which is often fatal, and more than 28,000 new cases of diseases like Ebola and Marburg every year. So we're talking about huge effects, and we're really talking about life and death situations. Like because of this, people are dying and will die. So the case about grants has had a sort of dramatic procedural history. We sued, the court granted what's called a temporary restraining order, so sort of just immediately enjoining the freezing of the funds. But then the government, and sort of ordering the government to restore funding on these grants that USAID gives. The government then didn't restore the funding. The court ordered them to comply, and the government appealed that order first to the DC Circuit and then to the Supreme Court, which basically returned it to the district court. And the district court ordered that the government had to pay for work completed by February 13th and had to spend the money appropriated for foreign aid on foreign aid. And that if things were going to be terminated, grants were going to be terminated, they had to be terminated sort of for reasons specific to the grants. But then what the government basically has done is terminated terminated almost all grants, or a huge majority of grants. So that case is continuing, and we're hoping to end up in a better place.
Okay.
But where we are right now is that the government has terminated many grants for foreign aid, and it's having a really negative effect.
So I know we've got some questions here in the chat, so I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll go to the other questions. What are the most important action steps that people on this Zoom can take to respond to the attacks on democracy, due process, and rule of law?
So I think part of it is just sort of paying attention and staying informed, calling members of Congress, protesting. If you have sort of the ability to get involved legally, for example, people who work for law firms, if they can take on cases pro bono. I think an important part also is just like not normalizing this. And, I think the administration is sort of overwhelming us with the things that are happening. And sort of it can be hard to take it all in. But sort of not normalizing it. And, there's some people who are sort of complying with outrageous orders or in advance. And so if people are able not to do that, to not do that.
Yeah.
I feel like my development office probably also would be upset if I didn't say that one way you can fight back is supporting organizations that are working to fight back.
Definitely.
And we would love your support.
Great. All right. So I see some questions here. Can you talk a little bit about the people getting deported with their minor U.S. citizen children, which I think just happened this week, or having them ripped from their arms and being sent away without them? I know that U.S.-born minor children have been de facto deported for decades now. What's new in this current situation?
I'm actually not an expert on sort of that aspect of the deportation.
Okay.
So I can't talk all that much about it, except to say like the idea of any US citizen, or really of anyone being deported without due process, but I think is problematic, and the idea of citizens being deported. I think one of the things, I only know what's been in the paper about this particular case, but I do think that that one of the issues with this might have been also the extent to which their citizen parents were being informed of what was happening.
Yeah, I think the father didn't even know.
Yeah.
Okay. The next question is from Anne. My journalist training makes me ask why. Why would Trump administration want to put our children at risk by dangerous toys, or our health at risk by unsafe food? What is the argument?
It's hard for me to see, but I think part of it is a sort of, wanting less government. So not wanting people to be controlled by the government. And, on the other side, we sort of have businesses and sort of being more pro-business and giving them the sort of latitude to do what they want to do. But, on the other side is the safety of people.
Laura added to the thread, the pro-business angle, right? To say because
Exactly.
but sorry, not to push too hard on this, but it really does sort of stick with me. So much of that consumer product safety is products coming in from outside the United States, right? Yes. Okay. I mean, that doesn't make it, just like it's hard to follow the logic there. Or maybe it's just all like tied together with the tariffs and trying to.
I think it's a slightly different logic than the tariffs, because I don't think, if anything, then you would think there'd be a desire to sort of keep out things that were dangerous and to sort of say things from other countries are posing a danger to us. But I think there is a sense that like it is more expensive to have things be safe.
I just want to jump in. I have no voice, so I apologize. I take umbrage with the description of the alternative position being pro-business. That is bullshit, right? That is language that I don't think any of us should be using. It is not pro-business to deregulate to such an extent that your workers die because they are exposed to toxic chemicals, or their children are consistently ill because you've poisoned the groundwater around you. Like, that's not pro business. That's not pro anything. That's anti regulation, anti community, anti environment. I just really want us all to think about the language that we use on a daily basis and how we have some agency and how we choose to talk about these things. Because I have found in my own individual conversations, even within my town, which is a strongly Democratic town, people use language that is patently false, right? That is just misleading enough to give cover to what is clearly either racist, misogynistic, patriarchal bullshit. And this is more of the patriarchal bullshit. It's not pro business. It's not pro anything. It's pro greed. So that's what makes me really, like, my hair goes on fire around it. Because I think that we undercut ourselves by allowing anybody else to give language to this issue.
Laura, I would just also add that I don't think the business community is actually many communities. You've got sort of B Corp communities, you've got much more traditional big publicly traded companies, you've got private companies that are not B Corps. B Corps are sort of much more kind of progressive businesses who agree to run their companies certain ways. And even on issues like climate, there's just a lot of businesses who have said we are not going to go back. Like, we actually came to agreement on this. And so I think the one important piece about the business community, it's not monolithic. So
And I do want to apologize. I don't consider these things pro-business. I think
yeah,
that is how the
No, I
people,
get it. I get it.
how the people out who don't want to prioritize safety or, or workers view themselves, and don't want to have to, when they're making money, don't want to have to take that into account, what, the dangerous effects of their products, or, how they're treating their workers.
yeah. Or maybe
I think
raise
in general, it's
minimum
an
wage.
anti-regulatory, you're right, that's just an anti-regulatory perspective. And when you get rid of regulations, part of what you're getting rid of is ensuring that everything around us that we're just assuming someone is paying attention to, that in fact someone is paying attention to it.
Other questions?
I want to surface one quick question, that when you were talking about the process of moving through the courts, and you'd mentioned contempt, right? And contempt of court was slow, but is there any teeth in that? Like, my sense is that the Trump administration is ignoring the courts on deportation because there's no consequence. That's my sense from looking at what's happening now. Is there real consequence that the courts can enforce?
I mean, we'll have to see. I think things like contempt are actually pretty serious. And so part of it is that, this is all pretty new. Like, the idea of the government not following judicial orders. I do think that we're beginning to see the courts pushing back, but I do think actually they've given the government a lot of chances in these cases, and they've put up with stuff that they wouldn't be putting up with from anybody else. And they're now sort of realizing that they do need to push back. But I think we'll see what how effective their tools are. I was reading today about how the U.S. Marshal Service, which sort of enforces contempt, is, I think, under the judicial branch, not the executive branch. So that could play into things. I believe that's the case, but I haven't really looked into that. So the judiciary does have tools at its disposal. At some point we really are just really at a constitutional crisis if the government is not willing, to follow what the judiciary does.
We set this conversation up as the courts, how the courts are the front line for democracy. And so what's behind what's behind the front line, right? That's the question I keep asking myself. And how long is it going to take? And how many more people are going to be harmed? Well, do you have, and I guess
I mean,
I'm not asking rhetorically, actually, I'm asking literally, but I also wonder, like, what is your,
yeah, I mean, I
10
think
minutes, like, what's
what's
your sense
behind the
of the
front
world?
line is the Constitution. That like this is the way the system is set up, is that when the judiciary says you can't do something to the executive branch, that it is not allowed to do it under the Constitution. And you know, to some extent, I don't know what happens if the executive branch just doesn't listen to that.
Yeah, okay.
Something we never
There
said.
are tools that can be used, but at some point, if it's just refusing to accept that there is a co-equal branch of government that has the right to say you can't do this, whose job it is to say that. If it doesn't listen to that, yeah, I think I don't quite know what happens then, to be honest.
All right. You've got a couple other questions here in the chat. What are the tools available? What are the tools? Hold on, what is this? If Pam Bond, like for example, if Pam Bondi won't allow the marshals to go enforce a contempt of court order, what's next? What are the tools that are available? How do we, the people, put pressure on the court? How can we build trust that they won't fold to rules that no one else is following?
Okay, that was a lot.
I think it all is about
Yeah.
how do we, yeah, what can the courts do? What are the tools? I think is what Laura's saying. What are the tools they have?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are tools like, contempt is the one that comes to mind. But again, I don't know what happens sort of if in the end, none of it can be, there's really just no enforcing of it.
Nicole, oh,
I
sorry.
was going to say, Adina, one of the things, because it is really hard to understand the contempt, because I don't believe we've ever had this situation before. And so, but when I was reading about it, it seemed like, I mean, the judge would have to enforce this, right? And against the administration. And then
Well, I
contempt,
think there's a
right?
like sort of sending it off to prosecution.
Okay. So they would have to get like
Or
an
at least,
independent lawyer to bring this.
I don't know exactly who it is who ends up
Okay.
bringing.
Garance is asking about the vibe in DC and where
Um,
is it going and where are we headed?
I mean, the vibe in DC, just in general, it's hard right now because so many people work for the federal government. So, anyone who works in DC, like, just socially, you go out and you talk with friends, and in every group, it'll be like, oh, I got, showed up at work this morning and my badge didn't work. Like, there's just a lot of people, and the people who haven't been fired, a lot of them, I was talking with someone who was working on a research project for years where suddenly it seems like that's going away. And so for a lot of sort of civil servants and, who really feel like they've devoted their life to doing, working in public service, I would say that it's pretty dispiriting. But I think there's also a lot of people sort of fighting back and trying to push back and do what can be done and speaking out. The Abrego Garcia case also comes out of Maryland. So I know a lot of people who have been protesting and things like that about that case.
I would also say the courts are not the people's chambers, right? I mean, they're the legislative branch of the people's chamber. And so, to the degree, especially if you're members of Congress or Republicans, reaching out to them about how all of this is completely abhorrent and these initiatives being taken by this administration are dangerous. Definitely Democrats too, like my entire delegation, I'm in Maryland, are progressive Democrats. So yeah, I can talk to them, but they're already having like the town halls to talk about how they're fighting back. So I think just protesting and getting, particularly in purple states and red states, and talking to your members of Congress, I think is really important because that's the branch that we, without bringing lawsuits, have the power to influence. Because we're not going to influence the executive branch, and um, it's the place that we can go. Any other questions?
I like this idea about a parade for the tireless workers,
Yeah.
work government employees are doing.
About the vibe in DC, I read an article, I'm sure you all saw it, where Trump supporters are like bummed that they can't get a date and that like nobody wants to date them. That's not just in DC, right? Like that's happening in New York. That's happening everywhere where men are essentially trying to pretend like they aren't Trump supporters, and then women finally figure it out and call them out on it and won't go on another date with them. I think I haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about it, but it has piqued my interest in just where power dynamics stand and with the pushback that we're all seeing on women having autonomy in any way. How can we frankly leverage this, and what can we do to sort of encourage women to stick by their convictions and to, like, don't go on dates with these people, publicly shame them, right? Do something.
I
Um,
mean, it's funny to talk about in that sense, but like I actually think that gets to Ingrid's question about the focus on the birth rate. Like I genuinely think that part of this like pro-natalist movement is extreme concern that like all these women can just choose not to have kids with them. Like I
oh, I
I I
agree.
I think it really gets to that, like, and they're just like really mad about that, that like there's a bunch of young women choosing like that would rather like just not have babies than have babies with these like Trump supporter dudes.
Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that women are, for maybe the first time ever, able to live autonomous lives. And there's this like horrible backlash of men's rights bullshit and men whining that they're unhappy. And I know Jana spends a ton of time on this, and I know that this is like a very large conversation. I just, and I've said it to Jenna, I have zero pity or empathy for shitty men. And so to me, if you're gonna be shitty, here are the consequences of being shitty, right? Sorry you didn't learn this when you were a toddler, but now you're gonna get to learn it as an adult. There are consequences. And so the consequences for you, 20 something in DC, who's picked to wear a red hat, is that you can't get laid now because you're horrible, right? Like that's it. And I sort of want to do something about this. Like this feels like a Barbie. Like let's go back to the Barbie Taylor Swift moment where we can just like get Beyonce, Taylor, Barbie, get everyone we get together and just be like, no, we're not doing this.
And
We're
all
not
the men who are getting
yes.
laid say, like, listen, you can have more. Like, that's what we need. We need the men who are like, I'm doing the good work.
That's right.
But I think one of the things we didn't talk about, in a
That's right, Amelia.
was sort of DEI, right? And the fact that has been just a giant pushback from this administration. And I think that it comes into some of these things, which is, the impression that's left is really they're only interested in working with promoting leadership from white men for the most part. And I think of everything that's happening in this administration, that's one of the most astonishing things, given, the decades it's been since the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement. Not that all those things don't require constant work, but it's profound. It is
Because
a profound reimagining of what this country actually is.
right. And they're using DEI as a shield to just turn back history and contribution. So it's beyond DEI. Like it
I
happened.
would say they're
That's
using it as
history.
as a spear. It's not a shield. They're using it as a weapon. It is
Yeah, but I think they're
crazy.
hiding behind it. Like, and people who don't know think it's really DEI, and it's not.
Right. anything that has to do with civil rights at all, they're calling DEI.
Right. That's my point. Like they're
Like in the
using
grants, anything that, studies
umbrella.
the different effect that like medicine has on men and women. They're like, oh, DEI, we can't, do this. And it's ridiculous.
I work at a university and we had to go through 80,000 pages. I didn't do it, but they went through 80,000 pages to go through to make sure that they didn't have those words that they've determined as DEI and illegal, right? And it's so ridiculous. Like women is one of those words.
I heard of something also, and this might be a little bit of an urban legend, but of them at some point taking stuff down because it used the word diverse, like we're going to use diverse methodologies.
Yes.
And they had
One
just
word.
searched for the word
They're,
diverse.
they're not smart enough to know the difference.
Oh, I think they know.
Oh, some of them do, but a lot of them actually, I think there's like an important thing, and I know we're over time, and I'm sorry to have interrupted you, Kimberly. But I think, you know, we've got Keystone Cops, no strategy, no logic, and then we have people who have been waiting for this moment and strategizing for this moment and drafting for this moment for decades, right? And so we got to know who our adversaries are. I don't know.
I want to send everybody back to their 2 o'clock meetings and thank you so much. Adina, here's my question for you, my final question for you.
Okay.
How can this group help you? What can we, this collected group right here, do to help you in this moment?
I think all of those things I mentioned about staying informed and aware and not normalizing things and speaking out and calling Congress and, protesting and supporting the people doing the work, in courts and in other ways. And we all
You have a community that you are a member of, you should come and be a member of the list. You need all of your support. You need a tribe of humans who are here to support you through this tough work that you're doing. Even if it is at the end of the day where you're like, I feel so lonely and so alone and so overwhelmed. And yet here's a community of other people who are also lonely and overwhelmed. Thank you so much.
It's been really fun.
I
Can I ask
appreciate
one just quick question, which is, I think one of the challenges of this moment is finding ways to understand what's happening that are not simple, but accessible to people. And I know I go among a bunch of different sites, but I wonder, Adina, is there a place? Lawsuits are hard to read. Even as a lawyer, they're hard to read. So are there places that you recommend to get a sense that people could go to on a daily basis to understand what's happening?
Um,
And you and I could even talk about this after the call, and I
Yeah,
could
the thing that comes to
follow up.
mind is an organization called Just Securities has a litigation tracker.
Yeah.
It just like lists all of the lawsuits that have been brought. And so when I was trying to figure out like what is everything,
Right.
that's where I go to sort of, and then you can click and sort of on the links to each case to sort of get the updates on those cases.
Right. Well, I want to thank Anne for working with me on this, and I want to thank Adina for your time. I know you don't exactly have a lot of free time at the moment, let alone the 2 toddlers. So thank you so much, and thank you for everyone who joined today.
Yeah. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much for
Thank
having
you,
me.
Lisa, for bringing her.
Thank
Great.
you.
More to come.